morning, everyone. Welcome along today to today's webinar. My name is Tracy. I'm one of the nurse educators here at Insight, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Isabella Ingram, who will be discussing her research around loneliness amongst people accessing treatment for alcohol and other drug use. She'll be talking to us about what loneliness encompasses and the Building Belonging project. So just before we get started, I would like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians on the land on which we are presenting today. So for us here in Brisbane, that is the Yagara and Trobe people. I would also like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to any respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be joining us today. Insight acknowledges the traditional custodians and owners throughout Australia, their continuing connection to land, water, culture and community, and their knowledge and teachings passed down from generation to generation. Okay, so Dr. Ingram, I'm going to pass over to you now and we will have a chat at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. I'd just like to echo what Tracy said in the spirit of Reconciliation Week and National Sorry Day. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we're living on. I spend most of my time living and working on the lands of the Dadaroa people. So I'd like to acknowledge that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So as Tracy mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a bit about loneliness today, a bit of a somber topic. And I suppose I'm going to talk a little bit about some background research that me and a wonderful team of researchers have done over the last probably 4 or 5 years that's led us to a larger project, which we're calling the Building Belonging project. So I'm assuming most people know what loneliness is, but I will provide, I guess, a little bit of a background around what loneliness is and how it can be experienced by some people. I'll talk a bit about those background studies that I mentioned in terms of how loneliness may be experienced for some people who are accessing treatment for alcohol and other drug use. I'll talk a bit about, I guess, the development of a group-based loneliness intervention, which we've called Groups for Belonging. And I guess a pilot study that we've done to kind of see whether it helps people. And then the current project, the Building Belonging project as well. So hopefully this will be enlightening and yeah, as Tracy mentioned, please pop some questions in the chat that we can get to later on. So most of us are going to feel lonely from time to time, but we might all feel loneliness slightly differently. So it's quite a subjective experience, meaning that, you know, it will be slightly different for everyone and what causes our loneliness may be different for everyone. However, it's commonly described as quite a painful and a distressing emotional state. And it's kind of been conceptualized, at least in the literature, as kind of arising when there's this real discrepancy between the quality of relationships that we want and feeling like we actually just don't have those quality relationships in our lives. Loneliness is different from social isolation, whereas social isolation, it's more objective. So it's kind of, you know, you look at someone and say, oh, they don't have any important people in their lives or they're not surrounded by others. And that would indicate that they're isolated, not necessarily lonely. So we know that we can be, you know, in an intimate relationship, we can be in a really large crowd of people, but we can still feel incredibly lonely. However, it's also possible to, say, live alone and have no one around us and not feel lonely. So I guess the reason that I'm talking about this is just to highlight that loneliness is quite subjective and it's quite a tricky thing to understand for oneself and try and understand for other people too. We know that there's different types of loneliness we can feel, and usually the different types depend on, I suppose, the relationships that we feel are lacking in our lives. So there's emotional loneliness, and this kind of results from a lack of a really close, intimate attachment. So most commonly romantic relationships. There's social loneliness. So this is when we kind of feel that we're just lacking quality relationships in our social worlds, that we don't necessarily have a group we feel we belong to where we can have shared interests and we engage in different activities with them. And then there's this existential loneliness, which is really this kind of this feeling that no one will really ever understand what it's like to be you, and this ultimate aloneness in the world. So while we might all feel lonely, we will all feel lonely, in fact, from time to time, there are certain times and certain groups of people who are more vulnerable to feeling lonely. So typically what we know is that, as humans, when we're going through periods of transition, this is when we are most vulnerable to feeling lonely. So for example, starting or leaving school, starting or leaving new jobs, retirement, relationship breakdowns, such as divorce or becoming a parent, for example. And the reason that these periods of transition tend to leave us feeling more lonely is because when we're undergoing these changes, typically there's also a bit of a shift in our identity. And so the way that we knew ourselves previously in terms of the groups we belong to and where we fit in the world, all of a sudden might not make so much sense or might not be so fitting for us anymore. And we're having to kind of reestablish who we are now that maybe, we no longer have a partner or we're no longer part of a certain workplace, for example. And so we know that periods of transition are when we are more likely to feel lonely because we are potentially undergoing a shift in identity. The reason that it's so important for us to be thinking about loneliness as, I suppose, an issue that needs to be addressed and chat about is because we know it's really, really bad for our physical and mental health. Most of you who are listening to this may or may not have kind of seen stuff in the news where loneliness has been talked about a bit more in the last year or so. But I suppose what's happening is that the research is finding that loneliness it puts us at a much higher risk of morbidity and mortality. So there's some studies that have suggested that loneliness is equivalent to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day in terms of how bad it is for our physical health. Studies suggesting that loneliness is worse for our physical health than being obese or not doing enough physical activity. It increases our risk of depression and paranoia, of stroke, heart disease, and dementia. So it's pretty problematic, and it's also pretty prevalent. And so I think based on the back of all this, our group started to think a bit more about, okay, well, what about people who are accessing treatment for alcohol and other drug use? We already know that this group of people, they actually tend to have poorer physical and mental health than a lot of the general Australian population. We know that rates of comorbidity are quite high. Rates of smoking historically have been quite high in this group of people. And so they're already at a pretty high risk of some of these things on this slide here. And we wonder if loneliness might also be an issue. So this kind of led us to kind of start a program of research in this area. The first study we did was just a review of all the literature that had been published on loneliness for people who have substance use disorders. And we essentially wanted to have a look at, okay, well, what's related to loneliness for this population? What are the theories? So what are they saying might contribute to loneliness for people who use alcohol and other drugs? How's loneliness measured and captured for this group of people? And are there any interventions? And do we know if they actually work to help reduce loneliness? And so what we found in this systematic review was that, unsurprisingly, loneliness was related to poor physical and mental health. It was related to substance use in terms of a greater severity of substance use and more frequent use. And it was also related to, I suppose, people's social worlds in terms of the quality of their relationships. So essentially the literature was saying that for people with substance use disorders, they tended to have poorer quality relationships, and that was correlated with higher loneliness. Likewise, stigma, unfortunately, is a really problematic issue for people who are accessing treatment for substance use disorders. And that was found to be correlated with loneliness as well as, I guess, this perception that others treat them poorly. And that, of course, is related to stigma. When we had a look at theories, there wasn't really a lot done in terms of, actually testing theories or really understanding what specifically predicts loneliness, but aligned with, I guess, other populations, there was sort of this mention of cognitive theories. So this is really about, the way that people think about themselves and others in terms of their relationship. That can be a real barrier to them actually going out and being able to connect with other people. And I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. In terms of measures, we just found that there was one measure. So it's called the UCLA Loneliness Scale. It's the most widely used loneliness measure across all populations that are being studied, really. And it was valid for use with people who are using alcohol and other drugs. And then finally, there had been one study that looked at a loneliness intervention. It did a small trial, but it found that loneliness wasn't necessarily reduced after the intervention. And the reason for this is that the intervention itself was actually quite broad in scope. So I think they did some goal setting within it, but the goals weren't necessarily just related to people's relationships or trying to improve their loneliness. So it wasn't really effective in helping people reduce loneliness. So based on this, we thought, okay, well, we need a bit more information here. There's some more work to be done in this space. And so we moved on to do another study where we essentially wanted to see how prevalent loneliness was and how problematic it was for people who were accessing treatment for alcohol and other drug use. So this study was conducted with 316 people who were accessing residential treatment. And so I guess I want to acknowledge that residential treatment probably comes with its own social challenges that may or may not necessarily apply to people who are accessing more outpatient type services or day programs. But I guess this was a starting point for us to really understand the nature of loneliness for people accessing alcohol and other drug treatment. So what we found when we sampled these people was that nearly 80% felt lonely at least once a month, and nearly 70% said that loneliness was a serious problem for them. What we actually did was use items from the HILDA survey, the Household Income Labour Dynamics National Survey. So we could try and compare these rates to the general Australian population. And when we did that, we found that people accessing residential treatment were 7 times lonelier than the general population, and they were 5 times more likely to report loneliness as a serious problem compared to the general Australian population. So I guess this just told us that this is something that is problematic. This is something that's really prevalent, and this is something that needs addressing here. So I decided that I wanted to go out and I suppose have a chat to people and understand what loneliness was actually like for them, and how they think that loneliness may or may not relate to ongoing substance use or to, their attempts to engage in treatment, for example. And so I did a bit of a qualitative study where I sat down with 20 people. Again, they were people who were accessing residential substance use services. And unsurprisingly, the majority of them were males, which, is, I suppose, pretty representative of a lot of the research that happens within alcohol and other drug use treatment services. And what we really wanted to do was figure out, well, what do people say contributes to their loneliness? What do they say the consequences or the outcomes of loneliness are for them? What does that look like in terms of their substance use? What does that look like in terms of the way they relate to other people? And what helps them to overcome loneliness, or what do they think would be helpful to overcome loneliness? And what we really found is that there were kind of these key themes that emerged. So in terms of contributors to loneliness, people reported, I suppose, this real lack of authenticity in relationships. So, people would kind of say that they found themselves in quite transactional or conditional type relationships that were often centered around obtaining or using substances. And this made them feel really lonely, like something was missing. But then as a result of feeling lonely, they'd kind of go and seek out just any relationships that they could find. And again, these were quite inauthentic type of relationships. And so we can kind of see this cycle happening here. Of course, we also found that substance use was related to loneliness here. So people kind of described, I suppose, a continuum, where people might begin using substances to help facilitate connection, to help, what's it called, the Dutch courage, I suppose. But then, of course, as substance use kind of increases and occurs along a continuum and it becomes more problematic, this is when people then started to kind of report that the substance use was causing them to feel more lonely because they were now being inauthentic in their relationships. Maybe they're hiding substance use from friends or family. Maybe they're isolating themselves as a result of increased use. And so this was then causing them to feel lonely. But then as a way to cope with that loneliness, they may continue to engage in heavier and heavier substance use, or even the boredom if there's no one around them. That's when more increased substance use would come about. And then we also found that in terms of what contributes to loneliness were kind of these key themes around the thoughts that were occurring for people. But we also found that these thoughts were reinforced when people felt lonely. And so I'm going to speak to that in a moment. But I think the thing to note here is that people were really, I suppose, really aware of how their substance use was playing into loneliness and vice versa. And there was this real awareness of what needed to happen. They were aware that, we really need authentic, genuine relationships. But translating that knowledge into kind of meaningful and helpful behaviours was a really difficult thing for people to do. So these are some of, I spoke a bit about, I suppose, the thoughts or the cognitions that were kind of really emerging throughout this qualitative study. And these are the kind of beliefs that popped up that we found were real barriers to people connecting. And so it was things around, fear of rejection, worried that, they were being stigmatized and discriminated against. And of course, that then can be internalized into self-stigma. And there's this real fear that others will reject them, that others will perceive them negatively. There was a real difficulty trusting. We know that trust is something that can be really challenging for this population. And so there were kind of, people reported doing head miles and getting really stuck in this cycle of thoughts. And it made it really difficult for them to go out and seek connection with others. But then as a result, they become more isolated and more lonely, and that would reinforce this style of thinking. And so it was a real barrier for people to be able to overcome these things. These are, I guess, a couple of quotes that came out of that study. So we've used pseudonyms, of course, to protect participants' privacy. But Henry here spoke about mistrust. And so he said, yeah, it takes a while before I can fully trust someone. I don't even trust my family in that. So I built, like a wall. Jessica here was talking about low self-worth. This was a really insightful quote, I thought, where Jessica said there's a deep sadness of unworthiness, I guess, but there's also a responsibility in it too, because a lot of the loneliness comes from self-destruction in the way of relationships. Jason talked about just perceiving that no one really cared and he didn't have support that was needed. And he said, I was lonely and I was surrounded by heaps of people, but if I had one person there that cared about me and knew, I wouldn't have felt lonely. If no one cares about me, I might as well just write myself off. It's like I use it as an excuse just to get messed up. And then Nathan here just spoke about this real fear of sharing in meetings and just being scared of being judged. And it held Nathan back from being able to make genuine connections going forward. So based on, I suppose, all this work that we'd done and what we'd learned about loneliness and substance use, we developed this intervention we called Groups for Belonging. So myself and my PhD supervisor at the time, Pete Kelly from Wollongong Uni, we partnered up with Genevieve Dingle and Kath Haslam from Queensland Uni. And we basically developed Groups for Belonging as an adaptation of an existing program called Groups for Health that was developed by Queensland Uni. And essentially we kind of tailored Groups for Health to be able to meet these really specific social needs that we kind of noticed that people who were accessing AOD treatment had. And so we based it on theories of what we'd learned from the literature and also what we learned from the participants of our prior studies. So the principles underlying this Groups for Belonging program Again, we're based on everything we learned, so that we know that loneliness is linked to increased substance use. We know from other literature, not just literature surrounding people with alcohol and other drug use problems, but mostly from elderly populations, we learned that increasing group-based connections where we can kind of really get a strong sense of our social identity and who we are, but also looking at those social cognitions. So those thoughts around, I'll be perceived negatively, I can't trust others. That's where we think most of the work lies in terms of promising loneliness interventions. We know that recovery is a period of transition where loneliness can be more pronounced. So initially, this program was developed with people accessing residential treatment in mind. And I think what we know is that, when people are actively using substances and then they try and shift into a phase of accessing treatment, their identity can change as part of that process. And there's a lot of work that's been done on this by Jen Dingle and her group at Queensland. And they talk about this shift in identity where we might lose an identity or we might gain identities. But what's problematic is if, we don't have, I suppose, a group we can move towards to. So when people are accessing treatment or they're kind of, moving along that recovery trajectory, they may be trying to move away from people or groups that they used to be part of and used to identify with as part of their substance using. But if they can't identify new healthy groups that are going to support their recovery, it can be a really lonely time for them. And so we thought, okay, well, based on this is when we really need to be helping people through that loneliness in an effort to try and prevent future lapses or relapses. So groups for belonging, it's based on the theory, it's based on what we know, and it helps people to really map out their social worlds and reflect on, okay, well, in my social world, who might be a risk to my recovery and who or which groups might be real resources to my recovery, and how can I use those resources and make sure that I'm giving myself the best shot here. So the program integrates components of cognitive behaviour therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy as well. And this is really around kind of understanding those really subjective feelings of loneliness and what it's like for that individual, and then helping them to kind of identify strategies to tolerate those feelings of loneliness that, inevitably we will all feel from time to time. So as I mentioned, it's based on theory, and one of the theories is the social identity approach. And so this approach in a nutshell basically says that our sense of self is informed by the groups that we belong to. And this is because our identities, or these groups, I suppose, they influence our values and the way we think and the way we feel and then the way we act. And so if we don't strongly identify with certain groups, it's really difficult for us to kind of know where we fit in the world. The intervention's also based on those cognitive theories that I mentioned earlier. And so this is really around the way we view ourselves and others in our relationships, then impacts how we feel and how we behave. And again, it was really around those beliefs that we identified from that qualitative work that we were really trying to hone in on here in groups for belonging. So this is a little snapshot of what the Groups for Belonging intervention looks like. So it is a group-based intervention, and that was intentionally designed to try and, I suppose, facilitate group connections, but also to kind of fit within existing programs that operate, say, in day services or in residential treatment services. So it's 6 sessions that are 2 hours each. And these sessions they essentially cover what loneliness is, how it may or may not relate to substance use for some people, and then I suppose the impact of loneliness on health. So there's some psychoeducation in there. We also do some activities, which I'm going to show you soon, that kind of look at developing the social world, and social identity maps is what we call them. We help people to really understand their subjective feeling of loneliness. So we give a lot of space to this so that people can really reflect on, where in their body they feel it, what emotions accompany loneliness for them, how do they tend to behave when they feel lonely, what are the thoughts that go through their mind that might stop them from connecting with people. We talk a bit about their values in relationships. So who do they want to be in relationships and what's important to them in relationships, and how can they then, live this life that aligns with that and that makes them feel like they are valued as well. And then we talk about some common barriers too. So stigma and self-stigma. We talk about difficulty trusting others. We talk about that real fear of rejection. And also we talk about fear of showing feelings as well as being a potential barrier to making connections. And then we do some goal setting as well, where we really try and help people identify based on the social identity map they develop. We ask them to identify, is there anyone they could reconnect with and reach out to that might be a resource for them? And are there new groups that they identify that they might be able to work towards developing connections with? So this is a little example. I've just popped a few little examples in here of some of the activities that we do in groups for belonging. So in the first session, like I mentioned, we do a bit of education around, loneliness, what it is and how it relates to health. And so this activity here is actually done in the form of a card sort. So we give all participants some cards, and each card has one factor. So one card might say social support, for example, like you can see up the top. One might say social integration, one might say not smoking. And we ask them to rank each of these factors in terms of how important they think they are for health. And you'll see here, the red dots on here represent typically what the perceived ranks are. So you see here, not smoking is typically considered the most important thing for health. So people tend to rate that as ranked number 1. Physically active is usually ranked as number 2. Not being obese is ranked as number 3 in terms of how important it is for our health. And most notably, social support is typically ranked last as number 11 down here. So that's the perception of most people. And this has been studied by Kath Haslam and her group from Queensland. The true rank, so the green here, is actually all based on a meta-analysis that was done admittedly a while ago now in 2010, but I think it has since been updated. But this is essentially what is actually important for our health. So number 1 is actually social support. The second most important is being socially integrated. The third most important is not smoking. So I won't go through all of those, but I think the idea of this exercise is it's meant to be a bit of fun, but also educational for people to really understand that, well, we might not think relationships and social integration impact physical health that much. It really does, and it really is worthwhile investing in this and doing the work to try and improve this aspect of life. One of the key activities that we do that I mentioned before is social identity maps. And so this is done in the first session of groups for belonging. And again, it's a really hands-on activity where we provide a big sheet of paper for everyone in the room. We give them Post-it notes of all different sizes and coloured markers and stickers. And what we do is we ask them to essentially map out their social world. And so we say, okay, well, on the larger size Post-it notes, pop down the people or the groups that are most important to you. And then on smaller Post-it notes, pop down the less important groups. Then what we have them do is we have them rate. So you'll see there's some numbers marked in the bottom and top corners of the Post-it notes. And we ask participants to kind of rank, okay, well, how positive do you feel about that group? And then how supported do you feel by that group? We also ask them to pop coloured dots on each of the groups as well. And so the green dots represent abstinence or no substance use. The yellow dots represent occasional substance use, and the red dots represent heavy substance use. And so you'll see that some groups, so for example, this person's swingers club engages in both occasional and heavy substance use there. And then we also ask people to try and, I guess, map out how close or how well the groups get along in their world. And so the straight lines that are in blue on this one represent that this person's friends and church, for example, get along well and they're compatible. However, church and the swingers club, their relationship is represented with a zigzag, indicating there's some conflict there. And so this is essentially a really powerful tool that we use all the way throughout groups for belonging to just give people a real snapshot of what their social world looks like and how risky or how resourceful each of those groups in their life might be for their recovery. I found, when I was running some of these groups for belonging sessions, that for some people, this was just a really pivotal moment for them to have this in front of them. For others, it was really challenging, and they realized that they had very little people or groups in their life that they would be able to turn to. Some people noticed that, rating the support or how positive they feel about each group, again, was, I suppose, quite an insightful moment, realizing that, they might feel really positive about a certain group, but actually really don't feel supported by the people in that group at all. So we essentially use this as a tool moving forward to talk about things like relationship values and what they actually value and who they want to be in their relationships with these groups. But then we also talk about their needs as well. And so I've just pulled this out as an example to give you an idea of another activity we do later on. I think it's around session 4 or so. And we ask people to have a look at their map that I just showed you, and then have a look at these different types of needs that we have and see if their needs are being met by different groups on their map. And we ask them to really reflect on, are any of these needs not being met by any groups at all on there? And if they're not, then this kind of moves us into the goal setting and the problem solving phase, where we ask them to kind of talk about, okay, well, where might you be able to get these needs met? Where might you, for example, be able to feel support and nurturance that you're not feeling from anyone or getting anywhere in your current life? And so then we kind of move towards identifying new groups and people that they could reach out to and what that might look like. So that's a little summary, I suppose, of what the intervention is like. I'm not going to labour on the next few slides too much, but essentially these are some results of a pilot test of groups for belonging that we ran across residential treatment services. So initially we had a couple of sites from New South Wales, and then there's also a couple in Queensland. So it's sort of an ongoing pilot study at the moment. Essentially what we found is that it is helpful so far in reducing loneliness for people. So this rules measure here, this is an abbreviated version of that UCLA loneliness scale that I spoke of earlier that was validated for people with substance use disorders. And we're finding that on that measure, there are significant reductions in loneliness. This DJG scale, that's another loneliness measure. And we also just wanted to see whether loneliness would reduce on another measure, and it is significantly reducing too, from before groups for belonging through till after the intervention. We're finding that commitment to sobriety isn't significantly changing. It's remaining high, which is great, of course. We're finding that cravings for alcohol and other drugs are significantly reducing from pre to post intervention. We're finding well-being is significantly improving, and that importantly, people's user identity is reducing. So this is that identification as a substance user. And we're finding that towards the end of groups for belonging, they're no longer feeling they identify as a substance user anymore. And then we just wanted to capture some satisfaction ratings and understand if this is a feasible program for people. We found that 98% said they enjoyed groups for belonging and it helped them to manage their emotions. And that everyone who was surveyed said they could have a say in the group, they'd recommend it to a friend. They're spending more time doing activities not involving substances, and that they're making progress towards recovery goals. So I guess based on all of this pilot work that we did, we put together a large project, which we've now called the Building Belonging Project. And this is being done in collaboration with University of Wollongong, University of Queensland, myself at La Trobe University, UNSW, University of Newcastle, and then all the peak bodies across Queensland, ACT, Victoria, and New South Wales for the non-government sector. And It's also being done in partnership with Kadesh and Uniting Care. And so what we're really doing here is we're rolling out groups for belonging across residential and outpatient treatment services across all of these states. And what we're wanting to do is really do a large-scale randomized controlled trial of the intervention. And so essentially what we'll have is 26 treatment services involved. Groups for belonging will be run at a random selection of 13 of those services. And then another 13 services will receive treatment as usual. And we essentially want to compare participants who do groups for belonging and those who don't to see if groups for belonging does in fact significantly reduce loneliness when compared to controls. As part of this large project, we're also really trying to understand client experiences of care. So people who are accessing the control site, so they're receiving treatment as usual, we're actually wanting to, I suppose, use that opportunity to sit down and talk to people about their experiences of care and their sense of belonging to some extent within the services that they're accessing. And so I guess we're conscious that for people who don't get to do groups for belonging, we want them to have an opportunity to still participate and still be afforded a voice, I suppose. And so we're trying to sort of use that opportunity to really understand experiences of care as part of this study too. So in a nutshell, that's it. I guess I just wanted to say that if there was anyone listening to this today who might be a staff member or a manager of a treatment service in Australia and you think that you'd be interested in being part of this large study, please feel free to get in touch with me. We're really interested to kind of be recruiting services that might be keen to be involved in this. Our intention, it will be a really long trial, so it'll go over the next 2 to 3 years, but our intention after the trial is that if groups for belonging is in fact effective, we just want to disseminate it. You know, we'll provide some training, we'll give you the manuals, and it can be used as people see fit to be able to implement within their services. So feel free to reach out to me via email if that's something that you'd like to know more about, or you think that the service that you're part of might be interested in being involved in. I've popped a couple of references on the slide for anyone who's interested. And that's it from me. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Bella. That was really, really, really good. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I've definitely noticed in my practice that clients reduce their socialising or they're engaging in meaningful relationships when they are using substances, often related to that stigma that you were talking about, but can also be a result of that substance use, which you also mentioned. So I think the work you're doing here is like really important, and your project just sounds fantastic. We do have a few questions for you if you have some time for us.
Of course.
Okay, so one that I sort of was wondering is that in my practice, I've often found that people can be a bit reluctant. Some of our clients can be a bit reluctant to sort of engage in groups and in these sort of different activities, especially in that early stage of engagement with services, for lots of different reasons. Is there some like first steps that you would recommend for like practitioners that are sort of starting off that engagement with clients to sort of help them around that, improving connection, relationships, and that loneliness?
It's a really good question. I think I'd just be saying, I mean, this is going to sound really simple, but I think I'd just be saying, just really trying to build the rapport and the connection with people, just listening to them and understanding for them what feels important. You know, who do they want to be and what do they want their recovery to look like? And I think just it's a luxury, I'm aware, for people who are working in these services to have time to get to know the consumers well, but taking the opportunity to try and just model what a healthy connection can look like, I think could be a really helpful first step for people to then understand, okay, maybe I can trust people a little bit more than I'd previously thought. Maybe I won't be so judged if I open up a tiny bit. And so I think as clinicians or practitioners, we all have an opportunity to model that to people in our really tiny interactions that we have, and that can then help them to begin the process of overcoming those barriers a little bit, I would say.
Yeah, excellent. So that rapport building is really important, isn't it? Okay, so some other questions, has been quite a few just sort of coming in now. One person has asked, is there any difference in the experience of loneliness for those in regional and remote regions? For those maybe in roles like fly in, fly out, that sort of thing?
I would say yes, probably. I don't know exactly, to be honest, particularly, I suppose, in the context of alcohol and other drug use. What we're actually trying to do as part of this Building Belonging project is to better understand that. Again, it's only in the context of people who are accessing treatment, so it's not necessarily for anyone who uses alcohol and other drugs. But what we're trying to do is recruit services to be part of the study that are from metropolitan and from regional and from rural areas. So we can really have a look at comparing what loneliness is like for those different subgroups, I suppose, or different geographic locations.
Yeah, excellent. We've also been asked, what types of substances were the participants receiving treatment for? Was there a variety, or did your research find any differences in program participation, engagement, or other outcomes, depending on the type of substances they were using?
Yeah, good question. Participants were using a mix. So typical, I think, of many treatment services these days, the most commonly reported primary substance of concern was methamphetamines, followed by alcohol and others. We didn't find any differences in terms of the type of substance people identified, in terms of how lonely they felt, or in terms of how many engaged in groups for belonging in terms of the pilot studies either. So it's seeming like at this stage, again, this is something we'll look at on the larger scale with this Building Belonging project, but based on what we know so far, it's not looking like there's huge differences depending on the types of substances people are using.
Okay. So the suggestions about would an increase in funding to set up groups accessed by social prescribing help to address this issue? I guess funding always helps with these sorts of things, but can you see, how that particularly would work? Or in what way?
I don't really know, to be honest. I mean, I guess the first step, right, is to know whether this is something that whether this type of group is effective, so we can have some real confidence that it is going to do what we think it should do. B, whether it can be readily implemented across a real range of diverse services in different locations that operate differently. As part of this large project, we are doing an economic analysis as well. So this is really so that we can understand, well, how confident can we be that this is a cost-effective way to reduce loneliness? What is then the burden on services? What might then be the burden in terms of burden of disease, for example? And so that provides a basis for us to potentially be able to go to the government or to prospective funders and say, this is worthwhile and it's something that deserves attention and it's worth you investing in for the sector, so that we can, say, reduce the burden of disease, or so that we can have, lower relapse rates, for example. And so we're sort of trying to embed that as part of the bigger project in this hope that it will be a first step to maybe get buy-in, I suppose.
Yeah. Somebody has actually sort of said maybe an increase in drop-in services, so arts hubs, those sorts of things where people can just attend on an ad hoc, unplanned sort of basis. So and around times that work for them, rather than sort of a structured content, I suppose.
I love that idea, and I think that's something that again, I guess we need a first step somewhere, so we've got to do our first step here. But I love the idea of actually people being able to just pick and choose bits, and it doesn't have to necessarily be in this structured 6-session way, that they can actually just choose which parts or resources within the program would be most fitting for the individual, for the stage that they're at, for etc.
Yeah, Great. We did get asked, are the groups for belonging program being run as a standalone, or within or sort of incorporated into the residential rehab program? Be interesting to see a comparison in results in different settings, which I think you are aiming for in that sort of project outcomes, aren't you?
Yeah. So currently it's all been incorporated into the existing resi rehab programs, but we're really, really keen to see absolutely what it's like when it's delivered at different services. I anticipate there'll be some challenges, with attrition, I suppose, at some of the outpatient services, and even just access, getting people to one spot can be really tricky.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely going to be a big part of this study is to better understand access and how we can optimize that for people.
Yeah, excellent. We have some out-of-state people that were asking, is this going to be, are you only looking in Queensland or are you looking across the country? Can people in other states be involved?
Yeah, look, I think at this stage we've partnered with the peak bodies in New South Wales, ACT, Vic and Queensland. I think there is potentially scope to extend that to the other states, but I guess in terms of, we've only got so much funding to be able to do this initial work. And so I guess it depends on how far away it is and whether we can just logistically make it work. But we're certainly open to trying to do that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Couple just final ones. Ruth is asking, has the program been used in harm reduction settings when abstinence is not the goal?
No, and this is something we've ummed and ahed about a lot for this project. We've been working with a couple of consumer advisory groups, and they really strongly felt that methadone maintenance treatment programs were a real area of need for this. Yeah, so we are trying to recruit some of those services potentially into this study. But again, it's not something that we've yet done. So there's so many directions we're hoping to take this going forward.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Okay, so if our viewers are wanting to be involved in the project, we've popped your email address into the chat, and Noel might just pop that in again before we log off too, just so it's sort of at the end there as well. But what sort of role do people play if they do get involved in the project?
Yeah, so look, we're still in the early-ish stages with the big project where we've just kind of undergone the ethics procedure, which isn't all finalized yet. But essentially, if you reach out, I can just give you a bit more information about what it would involve. Really, I guess the ideal scenario is that at each of the services, we will have a research clinician that would come out if they were randomized to receive groups for belonging. We'd have a clinician come out to kind of facilitate the intervention. But we're really hopeful that it can actually be co-facilitated with a staff member of the service, just to really help, I suppose, with training and dissemination. So someone there actually, I guess, understands the program and that they can then go ahead and implement it going forward at their service without the need for us to be involved. Yeah, so I guess, there's no real commitment from, staff or managers at the service, but that's the ideal case, is that we would hope that could happen. If the service was randomized to the control condition where they wouldn't receive groups for belonging, they could eventually access it after the study, of course. But at this stage, it would just involve, again, a member of the research team coming out, chatting to the staff and to participants there, and asking if anyone's interested to do some surveys or some interviews to talk about experiences of care and what care means to them and how it can be improved potentially.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Just one final one is, are you going to have, or do you have maybe some resources for people who potentially can't be involved in the project, but sort of like this idea of making some connection, or maybe forming a group in their service to increase these connections and these relationships and reducing that loneliness. Is there something that anything that you've got that helps with that?
No, but I think we could develop something for sure. I guess the only thing I'd be thinking is we just need to finalise the services involved in the project so that services say that we're in the control condition weren't accidentally still getting some program content, for example.
Yeah.
Because that would then, potentially make our results a bit confounded.
Yeah.
So once we've kind of shored up all the services that will actually be involved, for any others that aren't part of the study, yeah, there's potential that we could develop some resources that they could try and use there. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think that is pretty much all the questions that we have. Your email address has been popped into the chat a couple of times so that people can get in contact with you. And there seems to be quite a bit of chatter there saying that people would like to be involved. So hopefully getting some contacts there. Thank you very much for coming along today and for your presentation. I really found that really a really good one, and I think really relevant to our work. I'm sure our audiences are going to take a lot away from it. Just don't forget, if you're interested in finding out more, to contact Dr. Ingram. As I said, the email address is there. Next week, we welcome back Cameron Francis, which most people would know. I think friends of Insight will know, who's going to give us an up-to-date overview of the work towards delivering drug checking in Queensland. So don't forget to add that to your calendar, as I'm sure it'll be really informative. And that's it from us today. Thank you again, Bella. And the recording will end up on our website within a week or so, and people can access it there if they want to review it.
Great. Thanks for having me.